sophisticated air defense systems will struggle to detect the B-21 in the sky.
Since the Russian-Ukraine war started, the United States of America has poured its manpower and resources behind Ukraine, helping the country to hold its own against one of the world's superpowers. For the most part, it appeared that both parties were even, seizing ground wherever they could and celebrating small victories. But with this latest move by the US of A, Ukraine might finally get the upper hand. The Russian Defense Ministry was left scrambling after 2 US B-1B strategic bombers approached the Russian border. What was it doing there? And what does it mean for the war going forward? Let's find out. Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine has been the subject of many headlines, countless protests, and debates as the conflict continues to force countless people away from their homes and cause devastating casualties. The conflict between these two neighbors didn't happen out of nowhere. Russia's conflict with Ukraine goes back 9 years, when the 2014 Euromaidan revolution drove out Ukraine's Russia-friendly president Viktor Yanukovych and brought in its place a pro-Western government. At the time, Russia made it a priority to prevent former Soviet states and even other states close to it from joining NATO and sought to undermine the relationships between members of the alliance. Ukraine, in particular, had a unique relationship with Russia, one that the Kremlin wanted to preserve for military reasons. If Ukraine succeeded in joining NATO and forming more Western alliances, it would deprive Russia of some of the benefits it enjoyed and stop the Kremlin from expanding further into Ukraine and establishing control in the country. Unable to stop the pro-Western government from coming into power, Russia took over an area in southern Ukraine called Crimea, but the Kremlin quickly realized that they couldn't achieve all their objectives by force and instead came to an agreement with Ukraine, ensuring that there was relative peace between the countries, at least on the surface. Ukraine maintained its commitment to join NATO, and Russia feared that by admitting Ukraine into the organization, NATO was expanding into Eastern Europe and could pose a threat to Russia. And in 2022, Russia succeeded in stopping any move to bring Ukraine into the organization. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, marking the biggest attack on a European city since World War II. In a matter of months, Russian troops occupied 20% of Ukrainian territory, displacing more than 8.2 million people. Organizations and countries around the world decried Russia's invasion. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the invasion and demanded full withdrawal in March 2022. The International Court of Justice ordered Russia to suspend its military operations, and the Council of Europe expelled Russia. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia and its ally Belarus, hurting the economy of both countries. But Russia's President Vladimir Putin wasn't ready to back down by any means. He declared that the war was necessary to protect Donetsk and Luhansk, two regions that wanted to break away from Ukraine and stop neo-Nazis from prosecuting the minority Russians in the country. Russia wasn't backing down, and the Kremlin had the resources to keep the war going for as long as they liked. But Ukraine is equally determined to maintain its independence with the West's support. Over $155 billion from 41 countries and European Union institutions have been sent over to Ukraine as financial, humanitarian, and military aid. NATO is coordinating its member states to provide military and financial assistance to Ukraine and President Zelensky as the war rages on. The European Union, for the first time in its history, provided lethal arms and over $3.1 billion to Ukraine. Many NATO allies, including Germany, reversed their policies against providing offensive military aid in order to support Ukraine. The United States has been the loudest in its support of Ukraine. The Biden administration has been relentless in its support of Ukraine, promising to fight against the Russian invasion for as long as it takes. The US alone has committed over $75 billion to the cause, sending over whatever Ukraine needs to hold the line. This doesn't include the additional $38 billion in war-related funding that did not go directly to Ukraine, but to other war efforts. Don't forget the additional $18.3 billion spent on grants and loans for purchasing weapons and other equipment. Finally, the United States has sent $3.9 billion in humanitarian aid, providing healthcare, food, and refugee support to those suffering and displaced by the war. Support from the West, especially the United States, is without a doubt instrumental if Ukraine is going to hold the line against a country like Russia. Russia's GDP is 9 times that of Ukraine, with more military might and expertise, and without Western support, it's hard to say if the war would have lasted this long or if Ukraine would have had the upper hand like it does today. In its latest line of attack, the US deployed 2 B-1B strategic bombers as tensions continue to mount between the two countries. The 2 US Air Force bombers were flying over the Baltic Sea. They could have possibly crossed into Russian territory if it hadn't been intercepted by a Su-27 fighter jet sent immediately after the bombers were spotted. When asked about it, the Pentagon dismissed it as nothing more than one of its planned exercises in the US, and the interaction was safe and professional. This time around, both countries were able to avoid direct confrontation with each other. But when the fighter jets did collide back in March, it triggered a US diplomatic protest. Officials from both countries were blaming one another after the US MQ-9 Reaper drone collided with a Russian Su-27 fighter jet, giving conflicting accounts of the collision. US officials said that the Russian fighter jets targeted the drone conducting routine surveillance over the Black Sea international airspace. They claimed that the fighter jet flew in front of the drone several times, forcing the US to bring down the MQ-9 in international waters. Russia, on the other hand, agreed that it was trying to intercept the drone, but only because it was flying near the Russian border and intruded in an area that was declared off-limits. As for the accident itself, that was completely accidental and merely the result of a failed maneuver. So, what's next for both countries? The Russian-Ukraine war shows no signs of ending. It is clear that the Kremlin's initial plan when they invaded has failed, but there can be no such thing as a draw to the war like last time. As the war draws out, Russia is counting on Western support for Ukraine to wane the longer the war lasts, especially in the United States because of how much the country has dedicated to the war. The future of US military aid to Kyiv is already up in the air after it was left out of a temporary budget deal to avoid a shutdown in Washington. Even if President Biden is dedicated to seeing this war to the end, he only has 7 months to do so if he doesn't win re-election, and there is no telling if the Republican Party will continue on with it. And not everyone is happy about the continued support for the country. Hasn't the United States done enough? Some would argue that the United States has done more than enough to help Ukraine, and any more support would only plunge the world into another world war. Continued support for Ukraine has adversely impacted the economies of some Western nations, and more people wish to prioritize and protect their country instead. However, the relationship between Ukraine and the US isn't as one-sided as it appears to be. Yes, Western backing has been crucial in helping Ukraine defend itself, but the US has benefited greatly from the war as well. Ukraine has steadily been destroying Russia's military potential, and even if Russia does succeed and gains Ukraine as a territory, its military might would be drastically reduced, at least enough not to pose a threat to NATO and the US for a while. Russia is paying far more than the US and its partners to continue the war and has already suffered massive losses of military personnel, weapons, and war reserves. If the war does end in Ukraine's favor, it gives the US more time to focus on China. President Biden believes that before the US can face the more serious foreign policy challenge posed by Beijing, the threat of Russia in Eastern Europe needs to be dealt with. First defeat in Ukraine means that Russia would no longer be considered one of the world's military superpowers, and it would need years of rebuilding before Moscow can be a menace in the region again. Backing Ukraine today, according to analysts, is a strategic decision rather than allowing Russia to win and having to face a much stronger Russian military at a later date. By backing Ukraine, the US can gain significant advantages without having to directly involve its soldiers in war. If Ukraine is defeated, Russia will almost certainly start taking back countries that the Kremlin considers to be historically Russian, such as the Baltic nations, Finland, and Poland. Some of these countries are NATO members, meaning that the US and other NATO countries would still be drawn into the war, even if they did not initially support Ukraine. So, how will the war end? The Kremlin regime could change. The Russian military could be worn out by the conflict, and Ukraine could win, or the war could end in a victory for Russia. Reports from Ukraine suggest that Russian military morale is weak, and it is reportedly shooting down soldiers who are refusing to follow orders in Ukraine. Entire units are being threatened with death if they retreat from Ukraine's military fire. Ukraine has already succeeded in gaining back 3 of the big cities that Russia took at the start of the invasion and continues to push the Russian military out of Ukraine. The United States and other Western countries have already crossed many self-imposed red lines in this war, and some suggest that it might have to do more to bring this war to a close. Russia, on the other hand, has had to make hinge adjustments to its military and political leadership. A rising number of people in Russia are already starting to express serious doubts about the progress made so far, and the Kremlin appears to be in a weaker position as they keep adjusting their expectations the longer the war runs. Russia still holds a significant portion of southeast Ukraine, and Ukraine is hell-bent on liberating the cities, including Crimea, which was annexed in 2014. But if the war continues, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for Ukraine to get back those lands. At this point, it is difficult to pinpoint what a victory for either Russia or Ukraine would look like. Any major shifts in the war going forward will depend on Ukraine's counteroffensive and how committed the US is to support the country. There have been some suggestions that the two countries sit at the table of negotiations because of the belief that this war cannot be won through military means without it costing more lives and leaving irreparable damage to both countries. Whether this will happen remains to be seen, but until then, which country do you think has the upper hand? And should the US keep supporting Ukraine? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more.